On the morning of September 20th, 2024, a dive team entered the cold, still water of Twin Lakes in South Carolina, and what they pulled to the surface that day would set off a chain of events that none of the people responsible had truly prepared for. The body had been in the water for weeks, badly decomposed, barely recognizable as the person she had once been, and yet investigators already held a quiet certainty about who she was. She was a 20-year-old woman whose mother had been trying to reach her for the better part of 2 months. A young woman whose own husband had recently been photographed standing next to a missing persons flyer bearing her face, holding a small box in his arms while local news cameras captured what looked, on the surface, like a grieving husband, doing everything he possibly could to find his wife. Her name was Jessica Barnes, and the story of how she ended up at the bottom of that lake is one of the stranger and more deeply unsettling cases to come out of South Carolina in recent memory. Jessica grew up in Michigan, and by every account from the people who knew her, she carried the kind of warmth that made her easy to love. Her friends described her as trusting and full of life, the sort of person who walked into a room and made it feel lighter. She believed in people, and she rarely went looking for reasons to doubt them. That quality was central to who she was, and it was also, as it turned out, something that was used against her in ways she likely never fully saw coming. Her mother, Cecilia Varvara, remained close to Jessica even after the distance of state lines separated them. They talked regularly and stayed connected in the way that mothers and daughters who genuinely enjoy each other's company tend to do, with an easy rhythm that you'd notice immediately if it changed. And in the summer of 2024, it changed. On September 10th, 2024, Cecilia contacted police in Pendleton, South Carolina, because something had been gnawing at her for weeks and she had finally run out of reasons to wait. She had been receiving occasional text messages from a number she believed to be her daughter's, but the messages didn't feel like Jessica. They were short, a little wooden. They lacked the natural back and forth that she and her daughter had always had, and no matter how many ways she tried to convince herself she was overreacting, she kept coming back to the same conclusion. Whoever was sending those messages was not her daughter. Police began looking into it and quickly established that no one had actually laid eyes on Jessica since August 1st. She had also gone completely silent on social media around that same time, and for a young woman in her early 20s who had an active online presence, that kind of abrupt disappearance tended to get noticed. When officers spoke to Jessica's husband, 21-year-old Brandon Barnes, he had a ready explanation. He told them that Jessica had left on August 2nd without saying where she was going, and that he believed she had either traveled to Romania to visit her father or returned to Michigan. He also mentioned that her phone service had been cut off shortly after her departure, which made tracking her down more difficult. He said it calmly. He said it plainly. When investigators asked why he hadn't reported her missing in the weeks since she left, Brandon explained that disappearing for days or even weeks without giving anyone notice was not unusual behavior for Jessica. He had been married to her since January 8th, 2024, he said, and this was simply something she did. The two roommates they shared the house with, Kendall Mims and Victoria Tippett, both 20 years old, backed up Brandon's account without hesitation. By their telling, Jessica's departure had been entirely unexceptional, just another instance of her coming and going on her own terms. Taken at face value, this could have been the end of the matter. An adult woman, free to travel wherever she chose, with a husband and two roommates all confirming that nothing unusual had occurred. But police were not satisfied. There was something too polished about the story, something too settled in Brandon's delivery, and officers found themselves trusting their instincts over the surface version of events. Investigators pulled Brandon's phone records, and that is where the case shifted almost immediately. During the first week of August, the same narrow window of time when Jessica had supposedly walked out on her life with no forwarding address, Brandon's phone had pinged repeatedly in the Twin Lakes area. He had made several trips there, and the pattern was concentrated, purposeful, clustered in the kind of way that does not suggest casual driving around. On September 19th, 2024, a coordinated search of the Twin Lakes region got underway. The following morning, divers went into the water and brought up a badly decomposed body. The condition of the remains made a quick visual identification impossible, and investigators knew they would have to wait for dental records to make it official. That wait stretched on for more than a week, though internally, the working assumption was already in place. While the identification process moved forward, detectives did not stand still. On the same day the body was recovered, they executed a search warrant on the house that Brandon, Jessica, Kendall, and Victoria all shared together. Computers, laptops, and a range of other personal items were taken into evidence and examined. Detectives also conducted interviews with all three occupants, each of whom expressed appropriate worry about Jessica's well-being and said they sincerely hoped she would be found alive and unharmed. None of them, at least officially, knew yet that a body had already been pulled from the water at the exact location where Brandon's phone data had placed him in the days immediately following Jessica's supposed departure. Then came September 24th, and with it one of the more striking images of the case. Brandon Barnes positioned himself next to a missing persons flyer showing his wife's photograph, and he held in his hands a small box containing the ashes of their stillborn baby. He looked to anyone who saw the image without knowing what police already knew, like a man in pain. On October 1st, 2024, the dental records came back, and the confirmation was exactly what investigators had expected. The body recovered from Twin Lakes was Jessica Barnes. She was 20 years old. The following morning, detectives returned to the house. This time, they arrived with arrest warrants. What happened inside that house over the course of that day unfolded in stages. Faced with the reality that a body had been found and formally identified, the three people who shared that roof began to come apart, one after another. Victoria Tippett told investigators that on the afternoon of August 2nd, she had been present when Brandon strangled Jessica to death. She had not been in another room. She had not been asleep. She had stood there, and she had watched it happen. Later that same day, she had told Kendall Mims what she had seen. The two of them had then made the decision, for reasons that have never been fully articulated, not to contact the police, not to walk out the door and tell anyone. Instead, they had helped Brandon carry Jessica's body to Twin Lakes and leave her in the water. Brandon himself admitted to wrapping his arms around his wife and choking the life out of her. He gave no reason for why he had done it, and he showed nothing that looked like remorse. The autopsy had already confirmed the mechanism: asphyxiation by strangulation. The manner of death was classified as homicide. By the end of October 2nd, all three were in custody. Brandon Barnes and Victoria Tippett were held without bond. Kendall Mims was released in April of 2025 after her legal team argued to the court that she had suffered sustained and serious abuse at the hands of Brandon and had participated out of fear rather than free choice. The day after her release, a new charge was added to her case: destruction or removal of human remains, and she was taken back into custody. She posted a $25,000 bond and was freed again. As of the time of this video, trial dates for all three remain pending. What came out in the weeks and months following the arrests revealed a domestic situation that, to anyone hearing it from the outside, sounded almost incomprehensibly complicated. When Jessica and Brandon first began talking online in July of 2023, he told her that he was living with his sister Kendall, who was pregnant. The sister part was a lie. Kendall was not his sister. She was his girlfriend, and the two of them had applied for a marriage license on July 31st of that year, the same period during which Brandon was actively pursuing Jessica from across state lines. What that means is that even as he was working to bring Jessica into his life, he was simultaneously moving toward formalizing his relationship with someone else entirely, while also lying to Jessica about who that someone else was. Despite all of this, Jessica agreed to relocate to South Carolina, and she moved into the home that Brandon and Kendall shared, believing Kendall to be nothing more than his sibling. For a time, the household appeared to function normally enough. There was even a fourth person in the mix for a while, a young woman named Julia, who had also become involved with Brandon and was living in the house as well. Julia was the first one to start putting it together. By November of 2023, she had reached the conclusion that the man she believed was her boyfriend was, in fact, involved with at least two other women under the same roof. She packed her belongings and moved out. In the weeks after she left, Brandon showed up at her new home without warning, multiple times, and she refused to let him in. He sent text messages she didn't respond to, and left voicemails she ignored. When it became apparent to him that she was not going to change her mind, her tires were slashed. She couldn't prove he was the one who did it, but the suspicion was clear. Shortly after that episode, Brandon married Jessica. It didn't take long before a new woman appeared in that household. Her name was Victoria Tippett, and her social media username at the time was something that told you nearly everything about how she saw her own role in Brandon's world. She became a fixture in the house, drawn into an orbit that only Brandon himself seemed to understand from the inside. As the investigation deepened, the full shape of what Brandon had constructed became clearer. He had been married to both Kendall and Jessica at the same time, a legal impossibility achieved entirely through deception. Both women had become pregnant by him during roughly the same period. Kendall gave birth to a healthy baby. Jessica was not as fortunate. In April of 2024, she went into premature labor after what those close to her believed was the result of a severe physical attack. The baby did not survive. That child's ashes were the ones Brandon held in front of the cameras 5 months later, during the period when he was performing the role of a husband desperate to find his missing wife. Cecilia Varvara did not learn until after her daughter's death that Jessica and Brandon had actually been married. Jessica had never told her family. She had allowed the people closest to her to believe that Brandon was simply her boyfriend, and why she made that choice is something that cannot be known now. Those who loved her believe she may have been protecting something, or perhaps she hadn't yet found the words for a situation that kept getting more complicated the longer she stayed in it. What her friends and family have been consistent about is that Jessica was not the sort of person to see danger coming when it wore a familiar face. She was open-hearted and trusting, and the qualities that made her who she was also made her less likely to second-guess someone who was working hard to seem like someone worth trusting. In the days before she died, according to those close to her, she had started making quiet inquiries about domestic violence shelters in the area. She was trying to find a way out, a way to put some safe distance between herself and the life she was living. She was not given enough time to do it. Brandon Barnes has never publicly explained why he killed his wife. He offered nothing to investigators beyond a bare admission of what he did, and those who were present that afternoon have not stepped in to fill that particular gap. What investigators and those familiar with the case have pieced together, based on everything that was known about the household and the timeline, is a theory that carries a reasonable weight given the circumstances. It is believed that by early August of 2024, Jessica had either discovered or was on the verge of discovering the true nature of what was going on in that house. She had been living alongside Kendall and Victoria for months, and whatever version of reality Brandon had managed to maintain was likely beginning to show its cracks. The working theory is that when she confronted him, or when he believed she was about to, something in him gave way, and what started as a confrontation ended with him killing her on the afternoon of August 2nd. Victoria was there for all of it. Kendall was told about it before the sun went down that same day. And the two of them, bound to Brandon through whatever combination of loyalty, fear, and complicity had accumulated between them over those months, helped him carry her out of the house and sink her in that lake. For the next 6 weeks, someone with access to Jessica's number sent occasional texts to Cecilia. Texts just convincing enough to delay the moment when a mother's instinct would override her willingness to believe everything was fine. When that moment finally came, when Cecilia picked up the phone and called the police in Pendleton on September 10th, it set in motion everything that followed. There is something worth sitting with in that detail. Cecilia Varvara knew her daughter's voice in writing. She knew the rhythm of her sentences, the way she started a message, the things she would and wouldn't say. And even without being able to point to a single provable piece of evidence in those early days, she knew something was wrong. The texts were doing what texts were designed to do. They were maintaining the appearance of normalcy, and yet they failed the only test that actually mattered, which was whether the person who loved Jessica most in the world believed they were really from her. She was right, and her decision to call the police when she did is ultimately what led investigators to Twin Lakes, and to the truth about what had happened to her daughter. Jessica Barnes was 20 years old. She had come to South Carolina looking for a life, and by every account she walked into something that had been built on lies from the very first conversation. She had a mother who loved her deeply, friends who described her as a ray of genuine warmth, and a capacity for trust that made her vulnerable to someone who understood how to exploit it. She had been trying to find her way out in the final days of her life, and she deserved the chance to do exactly that. The courts have yet to have the final word on the 3 people who were arrested in October of 2024. What each of them knew about the others, how much they understood about the full scope of Brandon's deceptions, and how much each played a willing versus a coerced role in what happened afterward are questions that will eventually be answered in a courtroom. What cannot be answered there, and what no verdict will be able to address, is what Jessica's life might have looked like had she been told the truth from the beginning. Or had she been given the time she needed to find her way to safety. If you have someone in your life who seems to be pulling away, whose messages feel slightly off, or whose situation doesn't quite add up no matter how many times you're told it's fine, please trust that feeling. Cecilia trusted hers, and it meant that at least the people responsible for her daughter's death were eventually held to account. That may not feel like enough, because in a very real sense, it isn't. But it is where the story stands for now, and it is what Jessica's mother fought to make happen from the moment she first picked up that phone. If you have thoughts on this case, or on the way it unfolded, leave them in the comments below. Cases like Jessica's are not as rare as we would like to believe, and the questions they raise about trust, accountability, and what justice actually looks like for the people left behind are ones that stay with you long after the verdicts come in. If this story moved you in any way, please consider visiting jessicasvoice.org, the foundation created in Jessica's memory by her family. Whether you choose to donate, share the page, or simply spend a moment learning more about the work being done in her name, it is a meaningful way to make sure she is not forgotten. And if you found value in this video, a like goes a long way in helping this channel reach people who care about stories like hers. Subscribing means you will be here for the next one, because there are more stories worth telling, and more families still waiting for someone to tell them. Thank you for watching.